Hey team, welcome back to another episode of the Strength Game Podcast. I'm your host, Nick O'Brien, and this is episode number 39. The Strength Game is a weekly podcast dedicated to discussing all things physical culture with the coaches, athletes, iron enthusiasts, and experts deeply embedded in the strength game on both sides of the profession, both as coaches and as competitive athletes. I want to thank everyone who has liked, shared, and commented. Your support allows us to continue to bring on expert guests and highlight more individuals in the strength game, just like our guest today. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the show on YouTube and any podcast platform you use. I also want to thank our sponsor, Cerberus Strength, for bringing you this episode today for free. Trusted since 2012, Cerberus is making the best strongman, powerlifting, and strength sports equipment and accessories, ensuring the ultimate competitive edge. Every one of their products is tried, tested, and proven by top-level athletes worldwide. So whether it's competing on the big stage at World's Strongest Man or training at home in the gym, Cerberus Strength equipment is reliable, durable, and of course, strong enough to handle all your training goals and needs. If you're in the market for the highest quality strength conditioning gear and equipment, be sure to check out CerberusStrength.com and use promo code STRENGTH_game to save on your next order. And in this week's episode, I am joined by Lorenzo Tomasiello. Tomasiello is a strength conditioning coach at the University of Maryland, where he's responsible for all aspects of training for the Terps women's soccer, gymnastics, and golf programs. Before arriving in College Park in 2019, Tomasiello was a graduate assistant coach at Missouri State University and has also served time interning at both Rutgers University and the University of Iowa, working with the Olympic strength conditioning departments there. Tomasiello is also a competitive powerlifter, competing in the 93 kilo weight class and training out of Tyson's Playground Gym in Fairfax County, Virginia. Like I said, I'm excited to have him on the show today. So with all that said, let's get in the game with Coach Lorenzo Tomasiello. What's going on, everybody? Today, I am joined by another Maryland Terrapin. We got Coach Lorenzo Tomasiello. How's it going, man?
Going good. Going good, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course, man. I'm excited to have you on today. I want to hop right into it. I know you just got done with a big competition lately, so I really want to get to the in-depth side of it. How did you actually start training, get involved in the strength game, and then lead to now a competitive powerlifting career, man?
Yeah, so I started lifting in I want to say middle school. I was 12 years old or so, going from 7th grade to 8th grade for football, because I grew up in Northwest Iowa for, I think, mainly middle school through high school, and football was really big over there. So got into strength training from there, and then that's where I really got into it. I was like, wow, I actually really enjoy this, and it's something that, it was fun for me at the time. But then going into my sophomore year, I ended up getting injured, hurt my back. And I remember just being out my entire sophomore season. And that was it was heartbreaking because I obviously wanted to play and everything. And then kind of moving forward, going back, was able to play my junior year. And I kind of had to reevaluate how I did everything. So I was obviously very cautious with the back and everything and trying to make sure that I did everything right. So I started do some research and research air quotes, trying to figure out what was the best way to go about this. But obviously at the time, sophomore year of high school, or junior year rather, would have been 2011. There weren't a whole lot of resources available. So it was mainly just bodybuilding magazines and the occasional article that you might find on the internet or something like that. So it wasn't too great. But I ended up doing a lot more bodybuilding style training. So a lot of high volume stuff that I would not do today ever. And I ended up getting a lot stronger. And then that kind of carried me into college. And then that's where I started getting involved in powerlifting a little bit more, where I met a lot of the people that were involved in the powerlifting club there, and they introduced me to the sport. And that's where it started to kind of take off for me. So I think it wasn't until I did a bunch of unsanctioned mock meets, so to speak, throughout most of college, but it wasn't until August of 2016 that I did my first actual sanctioned competition through the USAPL. And then So that was like my college lifting career. I also did like an Olympic lifting meet back in 2015 too, oddly enough. And then moving forward into like when I was in grad school in Missouri, still continued to do powerlifting, still was writing all my own training programs, all that stuff, through just different stuff that I picked up through whether it be YouTube or other people within the powerlifting club or just kind of things that I've read. Did a lot of my own training through there, did another meet in, I want to say it was 2018, and then continued to train myself a little bit. And then I started to really stall out and I started to notice like, okay, I'm starting to like get some nagging things going on here and there. So I thought, okay, like maybe it's time I get a coach and I'll give it a run with the coach. And if it doesn't go from there, then I might just kind of put training on the wayside. So I started considering a lot of like bigger name coaches and things like that. And I actually opted going for a more local guy in the area. And then basically we've been working together now for the past 2.5 years. I've done 2 competitions with him and it's been great. So it's really taken off since then.
That's awesome. Yeah, I kind of want to get into it because at the same time that you started your powerlifting career, like actually doing your first sanctioned one is pretty much the same time you actually got involved in strength conditioning. But before we kind of get into your career and like some of the internships you did, even up to the grad school at Missouri State, up until your current position in Maryland, I really kind of want to touch on the importance of actually having your own coach. Like you found out pretty quick that you stalled out, you kind of plateaued. I mean, I've dealt with it before too, and still kind of do my own programming just because it's weird at the time, like what I'm doing to explain to someone that I'm trying to compete in 2 sports and also try to do jujitsu sometimes. And sometimes I lift at 6 a.m. and sometimes I lift at 7 p.m. It's hard to plan, but what's been kind of some of the big benefits, even as yourself as a strength coach, having your own powerlifting coach?
So I would say I'm going to break it up in like training and then how I've like pulled things from coaching. So from a training perspective for myself, it really allowed me to remove a lot of my biases on training. So I think that was my main issue kind of going into like writing a lot of my own programs and things like that. I always had my biases and then I was always like kind of changing things here and there. And obviously that leads to inconsistencies as you're training too, because it's like if you're not consistently doing something over time, you're not really going to get that much better. You have to, especially in powerlifting, because it's so invariable, I guess. And then at the same time, it's like I was a big fan of running myself into the ground. I would just be like, okay, yeah, so I could totally do 5 sets of 12 on back squats today. What's the big deal? That's a huge over exaggeration, but I mean, like that was kind of what it was. And that's probably why I started running into a lot of these issues. And so getting the coach allowed me to kind of really just turn my brain off. And it was kind of just like, okay, here's the training program. Here's what I'm doing today. If I have any questions, I'll ask. And then I'll send him my videos and then he'll give me feedback on that and we'll go from there. So that made it great. And then having that powerlifting coach also kind of opened my eyes to some things that I didn't really expect. And then like different interpretations of things that I've read as well. Because obviously having this powerlifting background, I've read a lot of different powerlifting manuals and things like that, and like how to apply, whether it be percentages or auto regulation or things like that. And we always, like when we read something, we have our own interpretation of it, but then seeing another person's interpretation of it and then applying it on you, and then you start to get a better understanding of it. And then having that better understanding allows you to better apply it to other people. Because once you've done it yourself, you're like, okay, so this is how it works for me. How can I apply this to the situation for my athletes?
That's awesome. Yeah, those are all great points to have. And I think that's definitely to be a proponent of finding your own coach so that you could actually excel at a sport. I know that even myself, and I'm sure a lot of people, we do have a lot of our own biases, either from the research or whatever articles and stuff we're reading, or even our own training. There's things that we definitely do like, or we want to include. And those are probably things that we're good at, or that's what creates some of our limiting factors, is probably the reason that things get stagnant pretty quick. And it's not having someone else's perspective or a different pair of eyes even on your training program. But I know personally that's the one reason that I really want to look into getting a coach as well, is just I want to be hands off with it. Like I already program all the time. Like I'm going to give you what my goals are. Just give it to me so I can follow it. I already have structure and everything. The last thing I want is real structure for my own program and chaos. it's a good point. You're really making me think about doing it even more now.
Yeah, man. Like honestly, for me in powerlifting, it was probably the best decision I ever made. Because if I did not like start working with Steve, I would not be powerlifting today. I can confidently say that, just because, he's been able to, really open my eyes to being like, okay, like this is it. This is what it's like. Almost like it's kind of like just being an athlete too. It's like, okay, this person's telling me what to do. This is how to do it. And now it allows him, he's able to be way more objective than I could ever be with my own training. And I think that's a major benefit.
No doubt. Hey, so kind of going into your career as a coach as well, did like your interest in lifting in high school and then kind of dipping your toe in the water for powerlifting with some of those unsanctioned meet, is that what kind of got you interested in doing some of these internships that you did at Iowa and Rutgers? Or did you kind of already have that in mind? And then what's kind of got you to your position now at Maryland?
Yeah. So it's kind of like a roundabout story, I guess. So I actually, in high school, when I first got into lifting, I was always really interested in it, whether it be like human physiology, anatomy, things like that. But I didn't know that strength and conditioning was a thing when I was like 17. Like I always thought like the only thing I could do is like, oh, so like I could maybe go into like sports medicine or something like that. I can go into something along those lines. And I honestly started off college on the pre-med track. And I learned very quickly that it was not for me. And at that time, I was still very involved in training, like I mentioned, with the powerlifting and then all that. And I remember speaking to my advisor and he was like, well, I mean, if you're really into training, like, have you ever considered strength and conditioning? I was like, oh, not really. I didn't really think that was a thing. He's like, yeah, like there are options in the high school level. There's options at the collegiate level. It's something to explore. So I was like, okay, I'll give this a shot. And then this was my junior year of college. I want to say the spring of 16. Yeah, the spring of 2016. So through the connections that I made through the lifting club and just all the people I've met through it, I actually met Phil Johnson. He was the strength and conditioning coach over at West Branch. And after I had that meeting with the advisor, I reached out to Phil and asked him about an internship. And that's kind of like really opened the door there. That was my first ever internship, was the spring of 16 with him. And I also interned with him in the summer of 16 as well. So do you want me to like keep going and just keep going all the way down the road?
Hey, yeah, that works. I didn't know Phil was in that mix too. So
yeah. So Phil, he was the one that got me to the Olympic weightlifting meet in 2015.
Of course he did.
Yeah, I honestly trained with him for like maybe, I want to say like 3 or 4 weeks. And then one day he came up to me, he's like, hey, do you want to do Olympic weightlifting meet with us? I'm like, okay. So that's how that happened. But anyway, so I did that internship with him. And then during that time, I was also taking a class. It was like an elective called Scientific Basis of Training for Elite Performance. And it was taught by one of the Olympic strength coaches at Iowa, Landon Evans. And, picking his brain one day, I asked him about strength and conditioning and like, what are some opportunities that are available? And at the time I was looking at doing a practicum, which is mainly just observational in nature, and coming to observe like what's going on there in the fall of what would have been 16, the following semester. So he's like, yeah, just reach out and then here's the people you can talk to. And then I ended up doing the practicum from there. And like I said, like it was only supposed to be observational in nature, but I think I was like a few weeks in. I was like, no, this is what I want. I ended up talking to the coaches and then it turned it into a full-blown internship. So then I was there fall of 16, spring of 17, and then even into the summer. And then from the relationships I developed there, I was able to get a GA ship at Missouri State. Was there and still competing in powerlifting, still doing all these things, still kind of learning about everything from strength and conditioning, powerlifting, and how to kind of apply everything. And part of my coursework was I had to do an internship outside of Springfield in the summer, or at least at some point during my graduate degree in order to graduate. So thankfully, I was able to do an internship over the summer. And what I did was I reached out to Rutgers because it was an opportunity for me to go back home, and it just was a financially feasible option at the time. So that's how I ended up over there. Interned with them over the summer, learned so much, and went back to Missouri State. Took everything I learned from Rutgers, started applying it at Missouri State, and just kind of take all those little things and starting putting it all together. Wrapped up my GA-ship, and then obviously, like once you're done with GA-ship, you start looking for jobs. And then I decided, okay, like I'm going to move back home as I'm looking for this. And I continued interning with Rutgers, and they were able to help me out. And like, that's how I was able to land a job at Maryland.
Nice. Yeah, I love that because I did the kind of the same thing during grad school. We had to do an internship, or I don't know if we were actually able to do it, but I finagled not taking a class so that I could do an internship in place of it. And it worked out well. And it worked out for you too, because I took a lot away from it because it was a different place. It was different atmosphere, different coaching style, different sports, different athletes. And everything that I was kind of able to learn there, I could bring back and still be a GA and still kind of learn and almost have like a safe place to kind of fail and have like full-time coaches like oversee me. But I could take everything that I learned from the internship and apply it to my athletes, which is really cool. And then it served you well getting to the position that you're currently in now. And you work with some interesting teams that are kind of all over the place. And that's one things I wanted to touch on, because you go from a very interesting gymnastics program to a very successful, very conditioning based, very relative strength soccer to a very cerebral, I could say, golf. So how is the training balance between those teams for you? And then we can kind of get in maybe to some of the specifics for a few of those programs. Like, are there any big like things that are congruent across all three teams? And are there any just like big outliers that you only focus on with one or the other?
Sure. I mean, I guess like if you take a step back, and at least from a weight room perspective, a lot of the stuff you're going to see more similarities and differences. You know, movement patterns, and everyone's squatting, pushing, pulling, hinging, doing things like that. I guess like the biggest outliers are going to come from like those sport demands. Like obviously soccer, like very big conditioning foundation needs to be established there. Golf, maybe not so much. Obviously, like they have really long sessions and things like that you need to be aware of. And then gymnastics, very high strength power sport, and then some conditioning as well. But I think the biggest thing kind of comes from that like conditioning aspect with soccer is that main outlier. But when we're looking at the weight room, a lot of the stuff is going to be more similar than different.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, there's a lot of differences between those. The one I really want to touch on, because a lot of people are never going to see this as a sport, like as a coach, or even like maybe even in person, just because America doesn't really focus on gymnastics as much. So what are some of kind of the training like modalities that you actually use? Because they are very different than a traditional field sport or maybe a traditional sport that youth athletes are playing growing up. So how do you actually go in programming for gymnastics? Because for those that don't know, they have a very low level strength training age, but they have a very high sport specific training age, because they're always constantly either on the mats, on the high beam, like doing technical drills and everything, very flexible. So what are some of the things that, like, when you first got introduced to them as a sport, kind of took you by surprise, and now you're kind of getting more adjusted to in their training?
Right. So I would say like I mentioned before, like there are a lot of similarities in terms of like how I train my athletes within the weight room perspective. But gymnastics, the biggest thing is you're navigating so much more. And then it comes in like how you're going to apply these things as well. Like you mentioned, right? Because they have a super high training age, but low strength training age. Absolutely right on that. And at the same time, it's like you're going to run into a bunch of chronic issues that they get from doing gymnastics so frequently. And then for so long, it's like you're doing the same movement patterns over and over again. And then in addition to that, like they're coming from practice. So they're already fatigued. At least that's how we have it set up with our schedule. And then they actually have, you mentioned that they do have, they're very mobile, right? They're mobile, but in a way that also it's not like traditional, right? They can do these things that are able for them to like do these things in their sport, but when you put them in the weight room, it doesn't always show up that way. It's weird. So they do have some movement limitations due to this high training age and that super low variability. So obviously they can move in certain ways because they've moved like that for their sport, but like when you put them in the weight room, it's completely different. And then another thing to add into that is that obviously their training is very low variability, but then even the athlete to athlete is you're going to see less variability than you would in like a soccer player or a golfer, because when you get to this level of gymnastics, they start to all look more similar because, you know, they're all fairly small, they're all fairly light. And that's just something that happens. Like once you start doing gymnastics at a high level, it's like you're going to start to see people that look more similar. In terms of like training them, it's a lot of the times it's really just meeting them where they're at. That's been my approach overall, not just for gymnastics, but for all my teams. I'm not trying to force them into anything. I'm more so trying to navigate like what's in front of me to give this athlete what I think they need without causing any issues, and then to keep them doing what they're here to do, which is in this case, gymnastics or soccer or golf. And then, yeah, go ahead.
No, keep going. I was just going to say I liked hearing about that, basically meeting them where they're at. And it's very interesting to kind of hear the mobility side of it, because most people would think like good mobility, good flexibility, like the more the better sometimes. And if a gymnastics athlete is very mobile, then that probably tends well. Like they could probably squat well. You don't have to worry about mobility issues. But now you're probably dealing with like excessive, and they're in positions that they think are appropriate, but maybe not under a load, because for the most part, they're just manipulating their body weight either through the air on an implement, like in different like axis or rotation and stuff like that. They're not actually like working with external load. So that definitely is something unique to that sport specifically. And even like compared to another sport like wrestling, where it is a lot of relative strength, but you're manipulating someone else's body. So is there anything from your powerlifting background and like some of your own training that kind of lends to helping them in their own sport? Or like you said, where you meet with them where they're at, you're kind of keeping it closer towards a gymnastics specific model, air quotes?
So I think from a powerlifting perspective, like I always have this base powerlifting lens. It has its pros and its cons, obviously, but I kind of relate to them in a sense, because we're both, like my training and their training, very low variability, but we're just on two completely different ends of the spectrums, right? I'm super locked up and stiff. They're the exact opposite. So, and they're super mobile. So I think that's something that I thought was kind of cool. I was like, okay, so we do have something in common here. I can work with this. It's just, I need to apply different things now. And then in terms of like programming and navigating those situations, it's interesting because it's like, you're right. Because when you start implementing like different weight room exercises and things like that, that's when you start to notice issues. Like doing a body weight squat, can they squat all the way to the ground, butt to ankles? Yeah, sure. But there's a lot of changes going on there that doesn't make it what would be considered a traditional squat, right? So you kind of have to take that into account. And I guess that's where the meeting them where they're at comes in, right? You want to make things simpler and you have to be adaptable. So from the get-go, like being able to navigate those movement abilities and limitations, which comes from trial and error, and then those sport demands, and then coming from practice, like it takes time. It's tough to say because it's like, it's something that I'm still figuring out. Like I'm going to look back at my program a year from now and be like, probably would have done something a little differently here. So I guess like biggest thing is when I'm picking out like how to write this program for them, like obviously I'm assessing the sport demands, which for these girls, it's going to be strength, power. And then, like I mentioned, some endurance, because they need that capacity to do exercises like beam, bar, and floor. But it's not nearly as much as something like soccer, obviously. And then also at the same time, I figure out like what I want to measure, because one of my like favorite quotes is, what gets measured gets managed. And for me, that's been vertical jump, which is something I've been tracking most frequently, like 1 to 2 times a week. At least that's what I did in season. So when it comes to like exercise selection and things like that, I pick exercises that have like lower learning curves, right? So, but allow for load to be driven with minimal technique breakdown. And again, I like to navigate these situations. I keep using that word navigate. I got to stop. But essentially give them what they don't have, right? They have hypermobility. They have all these movement abilities, but it's like maybe they might need a little bit of stiffness or something like that. So for me, a lot of what my programming looks like for them has been jumps. Most recently, I've actually been experimenting with some assisted and resisted jumps, and then trap bar deadlift variations, safety bar squat variations, bench press as kind of like my primary exercises, so to speak. And then I fill in the gaps with accessories, oftentimes transitioning from like more bilateral exercises going into unilateral and alternating base movements. And I kind of like to use that to fill those gaps within the training. And like kind of like how you mentioned before, like with those movement limitations, it's funny because this is probably like the funniest thing I've seen with this is I remember one time I tried getting with the back squat, and I've never seen somebody look so uncomfortable just putting their arms back like here. I was like, wow, I did not expect that. That was probably like the first few weeks I was working with them, or probably the few weeks in after we've like did a phase of like goblet squats and things like that. And I was like, wow, okay, like this is interesting. So let's try the safety bar. And they took really well to it. So I've just been using that and kind of rolling with it.
Awesome. Yeah, it's definitely a little trial and error when you're doing something different, but I didn't think of it like that too. Like based off your background, like extensively in powerlifting and their background extensively in gymnastics, they are two completely different spectrums of very loose, very stiff. So it does probably lend well to your own training to kind of take some bits and pieces from their program where you can kind of get looser, because it does probably help a little bit to stay athletic as a power lifter, and then for them as well to be stiff and be able to produce and absorb force a little bit more too, rather than just kind of noodly all the time and overly mobile. Definitely does help. I thought that was always funny too when we used to bring the swimmers out of water, and just once we kind of got through some GPP stuff and like kind of got them into the lifting model, sometimes just for fun we'd have them do ladders just to kind of see what they look like, because they really are fish out of water. So I'm sure putting a bar on the back of some of those gymnasts was the same type of feeling, and maybe not expected just based off them executing in the gymnast, like in the actually room more so, but to actually get them in the weight room and see what they're able to accomplish, that's definitely something I didn't expect. So you talked about measuring a little bit. Measuring is kind of weird, and scoring in gymnastics is really weird. And we talked about it before we started recording about powerlifting and some of the subjective side. So in terms of measuring stuff, like within their actually lifting program, outside of like vertical jump and everything, do you track some of their lifting numbers or try to put some measurable things that they can actually obtain? Because I feel, and I might just be assuming here, just like swimmers and throwers and track athletes, like they like to see numbers, they like to see progress and everything. Is that a good kind of assumption?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, in addition to the vertical jump testing, which I do track weekly, and I actually give them feedback on that so that way they can see the progress, I also track those numbers for basically all of it. But in terms of, obviously I give them their sheet and they write in their numbers for all the accessory work, and that just increases week to week. But I used to do like rep max testing, and I used to do things like that over time. What I've recently taken to has been embedded testing on a weekly basis. So normally what I'll do is I got this from powerlifting, honestly, and it's something that I've had in my own program for the longest time. It's been using RPE. RPE has been something that has been really useful for me in terms of auto-regulation, not only for myself, but for my athletes as well. So it initially evolved from like, I would prescribe them a percentage and then a weight and then a reps, and then they'd give me the RPE. And then eventually that kind of turned into, depending on the scenario, depending on what team I was working with, I sometimes gave them reps and RPE, and I let them pick the weight. And now I've gotten to the point where I actually have like the reps, the RPE that I'm giving them, and then I also give them a weight range, which kind of fluctuates between 1 to half an RPE lower or higher. And that's something that I picked up from powerlifting. And it's actually worked pretty well because it allows them to, sometimes it's hard when applying RPE because it's like athletes don't really know how strong they are. But when you give them a range to work off of, it kind of takes a little bit of the thinking out of it. And that's worked really well for me. So they come in and they usually they'll do like a top set, and then they'll get to pick from the range. And then they have additional back down work where they'll have something like usually like a 10% drop off. And then depending on what they did there is what they do for the back down work. And that's worked pretty well. And it's helped with that auto regulation side of things.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good way to do it, because I think most people they think about the end result when trying to implement RPE, and it's like, hey, this is difficult. Athletes just don't understand, and they feel like they're beating their head against a wall. But that's kind of a very logical progression to do it. Like, give them the weight and reps, and then they tell you how difficult it was. And then once they kind of get a handle for, oh, this is how it personally feels for me, now you can kind of switch the scheme around a little bit. And then this is how many reps I want you to hit. Like, this is how it should feel. Now you pick the weight. I really like that. That's good. And especially I think for gymnastics, to give them back off sets where they can start to build a little bit more volume in and really be accustomed to the lift and the movement that they're trying to actually pattern properly. That's definitely a great way to add a little bit more into it. So, yeah. I mean, you're relatively young in your career, speaking, like going from a graduate assistant into a full-time position, like from Missouri State right into Maryland. So what are some of like maybe the bigger lesser known kind of changes that you've had to kind of undergo in that transition? I mean, everybody's GA is a little bit different, like how many teams you're actually working with. Do you actually get legitimate oversight over a team and get to program and things like that? So what, from your experience, how was the transition like? And has there been anything that maybe popped up that you just either weren't prepared for or just didn't think was going to be a full-time duty?
Yeah, for sure. I think you kind of mentioned it right there. So when I was at Missouri State, I was working with basically every team in the weight room besides, I think, basketball, football. That was about it. And so I had my hands full. So I spent all my time in the weight room. So I would say like the biggest change was just getting out of the weight room, both literally and kind of figuratively speaking. Because when I came here, going from all those teams to just 4, like it frees up time to do other things. So I spend a lot of time now out at soccer practice. I go to gymnastics practice on occasion. I'm doing the warm-ups for soccer, doing the GPS for soccer. And it's being able to like change that mindset. Like, okay, like how am I going to apply this now to the field, or doing like in-gym conditioning sometimes, or in-gym workouts? That has been a huge change for me. And then in addition to that, it's since I spent so much of my time in the weight room as a GA, like you don't get those daily interactions with coaches as much. And now it's like, as a full-time assistant, it's you're interacting with coaches on the daily, and you're getting to learn like, okay, like this is what they're looking for. This is how they speak. And this is how they understand things from this specific sports context. And being able to better wrap my head around that and integrate with the coaching staff has been huge.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of hard to tell. No one really knows. No one's really prepared for their first full-time job. And even different places are completely different. You could have 7 to 10 teams as a full-time, or you could have 1. You never know. And then your on-court or on-field responsibilities could be very different, or you could be stuck in the weight room still as a full-time. But I mean, from your experience, what advice would you give someone, or what would you do anything different to kind of prepare yourself for a full-time position, kind of knowing what you know, and then understanding that transition that you had to undergo up to your spot now?
Yeah, I would definitely say like getting out of the weight room was probably the biggest piece. I wish I would have spent more time, going out to soccer practices as a GA and doing those things, and maybe picking the coach's brain a little bit more. I think that would have been awesome. And then in addition to that, like asking simple questions that you didn't think were really worth asking. because you never know where those questions can really take the conversation. It's something that I tell the interns now, that it's like, okay, that's something I wish I would have done when I was an intern. And then I was told this when I was an intern already, but it's something that I keep reiterating to myself all the time. Is like, you're going to make mistakes, especially like going into your first full-time job. You make so many mistakes. It's a matter of you really learning from it, and kind of taking that and getting better, not necessarily like letting that bog you down.
For sure. No, that's great advice too. And you kind of touched on it a little bit. I know that we've spoken with some other guys at Maryland too about some of your guys' sports technology. And I know there's been a few advancements. You guys are kind of pushing forward. And you spoke a little bit on it too with the GPS system and you going out to practice with soccer and now being in a full-time role. Like, it's very beneficial for you to not only see what you're doing in the weight room, but to go out to practice, have those interactions, and see how that application is actually unfolding on the field. Between actually going out to practice and knowing what you do in the weight room, how is like using some sports science and technology kind of helped you either tweak what you're doing in the weight room or better help what you're doing with the players for warm-ups, for any conditioning sessions, thing like that, even specifically for soccer at the moment?
Sure. So from a GPS perspective, yeah, it really, it kind of put context to what I was looking at when I was out on the field, right? So if I saw like, okay, like the team's playing big today, I would look back at the data and be like, okay, that makes sense as to why they got this much high intensity meters or why they got this much total distance. And then you can kind of see how that plays out over time too, because I think that's the biggest piece when it comes to like this monitoring aspect. It's not necessarily like the snapshots, but how it looks from week to week, month to month, and things like that. In terms of programming and things like that, I guess it does allow me to make adjustments when I need to. Soccer is a little different because it's when they're in season, the weight room doesn't really take that big of a priority. But when it comes to doing on-field stuff, that's where I kind of start to implement different things, right? So one of the biggest things is like high intensity distance with GPS. And what I've done is I've been looking at the GPS data from the week, and I'll typically kind of compare it to like previous weeks or something like that. And I'll say like, okay, like maybe we need to get a little bit more sprinting in today because we didn't get a whole lot of it in yesterday, and we need to make sure we get enough for the week. Or maybe we just do less in today's warm up and we just kind of take it down a notch and really just make this just a general warm up, make sure that they're good to go for today's practice. In addition to that, it has also helped me from the conditioning programming side, because it gives me context in terms of like, how much are they going to be running when they come here in preseason? Like, how much do I need to prepare them for when I'm writing these summer packets, when I'm writing these conditioning programs? And then I can kind of like work backwards from there. But that has been extremely useful for me. And then it's also opened up lines of communications with the coaching staff as well, especially if I see something that looks kind of funny or anything like that. I can be like, hey, like, make sure like we might want to do a little bit less. We might want to do a little bit more in this case.
Yeah, those are all great points. Definitely, I like working back and now kind of understanding what the demands of the sport are. And I mean, before we got all this technology, it was really just kind of combing through articles or keeping track of maybe stats from professionals and everything, but it really wasn't all that applicable, especially if it was a male to female sport, if it was professional going down to college, down to high school, and then even like style play, that has a huge thing into it now. But now that we're starting to see more of this sports science come into play, you can really get a feel for, this is what practice looks like on Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, pre-game. This is what we actually look like in a match. And then you can prepare them even and dial it in even more so leading into preseason without overcooking them and then without undershooting it too. So you can get a little bit more specific and dial it in perfectly, which is definitely cool concepts to kind of touch on, and definitely like being able to have conversations with the coaches too, and make sure that what you guys are doing is complimenting them, is preparing them for what the intention of the drills are doing. Those are all great pieces to kind of touch on. I wanted to kind of go back a little bit, touch on your like actual training, and now being in a full-time role, it's a little bit different from a GA as well. you are trying to compete and you're training and everything, you do it both, I know, sometimes at work and then sometimes training at another facility. Is there a benefit that you kind of see from getting outside of the Terps weight room and off college campus and being able to like be in a powerlifting environment? Or are there any drawbacks to that as well for like maybe strength coaches that want to get out of the weight room and go to a different weight room?
Yeah, so I've honestly stopped training at work. Today was actually my first day that I trained at work in probably, I want to say, months. And that's mainly just because I need a change up of environment if I'm going to like have a successful training session. It's something that I've learned because sometimes you just get kind of staring at the same walls all day, and you kind of need a change of environment. And then in addition to that, it's nice to be surrounded by other people that are also doing your sport. I've been able to like develop some really great relationships with the people over at the gym that I train at. And it's always nice having that support and knowing that like, hey, like if I'm about to take a heavy squat, like I have 5 guys that are ready to hop in and spot me if need be. At the same time, it's like, it's also great just having that hype crew behind you too. But you know, I think it's definitely tough because I understand like if I'm going to train at work, it's mainly for the convenience aspect because it's right here and it's something I can get done, especially if I have like a shorter training session or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. The convenience side of it, I know having conversations with people I compete against all the time, they're like, it must be so easy for you to just train like you're in the weight room. I was like, my office is also the weight room. So the amount of times that I get interrupted, like for good intentions or bad intentions, or just to change the music or unlock a door, like you can't imagine how much it is. And like you said too, to stare at the same wall, to stare at the same rack, to kind of be in the same place for 12 plus hours and then really try to grind out like a quality training session if you're trying to be competitive in your sport. And you might be the only person in that building that is actually training for that sport. It is a difficult thing. So convenience is maybe the only thing you really have on your side for it. So it's definitely a good thing to go out and then have a team within a team. Like I know where you train too for a lot of powerlifters. So that's a good benefit.
Yeah. Plus the equipment is actually very different. I feel like that's one thing that people kind of forget is like, I feel like people kind of understand like, oh, weight is weight. It doesn't really matter as much. But when you start getting to that, I've noticed this, like when you start going up to a certain level, it's like the little things start to matter more. The type of bench that you bench on, the bar that you're using, whether you're using kilos or pounds, or whether you're using bumpers, like all that kind of stuff plays into the competition as well, because the competition is going to be standardized to a certain degree. And the better that you can kind of get more specific with it, the more prepared you're going to be for that situation. A good example of that is like being the meet that I just did. They use a specific rack, and the gym that I train at didn't have that rack, but I still train on the ones that we use, obviously still competition specific or competition spec. But I went to another gym that had that specific rack for bench press just so I can get a feel for it. And I realized like it totally threw me off. I was like, wow, this is crazy how just something as simple as a completely different brand rack can throw you off, or even a different barbell or something like that. And it's crazy how like these little things start to pop up, and like you wish it didn't. You wish it was like you feel kind of like you feel kind of like I can't really think of the word, but just like you're overthinking this situation. But these things do play a role.
No, for sure. I mean, yeah, you do start getting like real snobby with it. And I start turning.
That's the word I was looking for.
I think once you get higher levels, I don't know if it's just the longer you're in a sport, the more of like a gear whore you turn into. You just start collecting all these things that just have one purpose. Like I have like knee sleeves that are just for one thing. They're just for stones. That's it. And I was like, this is dumb to carry them in a bag, but they actually make a super big difference. And when you start trying to squeak out just 1%, like 1 inch here, like one good feeling there, like this bench is 2 centimeters wider. When you're playing with fire like that, and you're really trying to go for like half a kilo, or you're trying to go for like a millisecond or whatever it ends up being, those things play a huge role. So I do think that's important too. And I think those are things that we probably stress with our athletes just as much. Like going into a squat haphazard and just putting it on your back without getting tight, without having your eyes set, without having your feet underneath you. Like all those things are the stuff that we try to carry over with them. So if we don't do that in our own training and like try to be meticulous with it to some degree, then it probably carries over to our coaching. So on that same kind of train of thought, I know that you just competed as well, and there's a lot of things that you put into place from your own like competition experience and your training background. How has that kind of influenced your coaching? We talked about you getting a coach and everything, but for your own training specifically and being under the bright lights and trying to go 9 for 9 as much as possible, like how do you think that actually helps when it turn around and you put the coaching hat back on?
Yeah. So I feel like, it taught me what it like really means to train for something. Like obviously I played sports in high school, but it was a completely different environment. And it taught me like what it means to just like day in and day out, just do the same things over and over again. Like my gymnasts, right? My gymnasts go to the gym and they do their routines and they have the same thing that they do day in and day out. And it gave me that better perspective, and it gave me a better understanding for kind of like what my athletes go through. And then at the same time, it kind of taught me to essentially like teach them how to be a little bit meticulous with their training within the weight room too, because it's like that stuff does kind of matter. Obviously not everything is going to be perfect, but it's like, it does teach you a lot, like just having that mindset of like setting yourself up for success.
Yeah, for sure. Does you think being a competitor like in your own right helps you kind of train competitive athletes too? Like was there a mind, if you can recall, has there been like a mind shift for you comparative when you were doing some of those unsanctioned meets versus now when you actually step on the platform and you're doing bigger meets now? Has there been a shift or a heighten in your competitiveness at all?
I suppose. I mean, like it definitely, it adds more stakes to the situation, especially like when you do like one of those bigger meets. But I'm going to point this out like right now, like when I compare myself to other powerlifters that are out there, like some of the guys that I train with are levels above me. It's ridiculous. Don't get me wrong. Like I still try to be as competitive as I can be. But I do think like having that understanding what it's like to be competitive and being able to understand what my athletes are going through too, and understand like how important all these little things are. Not just like saying like, oh, you need to make sure that you're doing these things right, but like more or less like intrinsically, like this is how important like this one practice was for this athlete, because I can relate to that. I can be like, man, my squat session went terrible today, and now I'm like, it kind of ruined my whole day. I can totally understand if one of my athletes had a bad practice, or if one of my athletes had a bad training session or something like that, because it just gives you that better understanding of what it is.
Yeah, I love that. It's definitely good momentum when it starts to build on each other, and seeing the athletes in a routine and kind of being in your own routine as well, having a program and something that you're peaking for. I think it definitely plays back and forth, and that's like a big reason I like talking to people about it, because when you're on both sides of the bar and you're coaching and then in turn you go and train and be competitive, I think they both lend to help each other out a lot. And there's a lot of similarities between the two, but I think they definitely better impact the next one. Like my training, I think helps me coach, and I think coaching helps me in my training too, even if I have my own biases, for sure.
Yeah. Especially like when you figure something out too. Like that's one thing I've noticed. It's like if I figure out a cue for me that works on like any sort of movement, I'm like, oh, like let's try this on one of the athletes to see if they pick up on it too. And see if that sort of thing clicks. It's kind of nice because you can learn from yourself and then apply it to your athletes.
Exactly. As much as I hate it, I think I get a lot of ideas, and it puts me in a better space when I'm actually training. And as much as I want to just put the blinders on and then like bowl through what my training is and be very meticulous, like I would for my athletes, and like be demanding on the time and everything, some of my best ideas and like some of my best programming stuff happens like when between sets. And I hate to sit there on my phone, or I hate to sit there and like doodle stuff down, but I know that they have a lot better chance of being competitive, and that's my job as a coach, to make them better. So I'll take a longer rest break between sets to actually write some stuff down, and hopefully it actually benefits them in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because like I'm in the same boat as you, where it's like a lot of my best ideas come from the training sessions that probably took me like 4 or 5 hours, because it's like I'm too busy like trying different things out. I'm going back and like redoing sets, or like just putting an empty bar down there and like trying to figure different things out, or whether it be trying different accessory exercises or things like that. Yeah, I get a lot of my best ideas from just that time that I spend in the weight room sometimes.
For sure. Yeah, I write down and I clock when I start lifts, and when it gets real long, I definitely don't write down how it ends, because there's always got to be an asterisk next to it that says, all right, I went on a tangent for like 30 minutes. So, yeah. Hey, what kind of touching on some stuff that you do, we talked about sports science and everything. I know you guys are working on that a little bit more and more, but personally, where do you kind of go for continuing education stuff? Like, I know you're working with teams that you didn't really play growing up, so you're going to practice and you're kind of getting a feel for how the coaches want to operate, how the athletes actually interact, and then working with them. But either on the coaching side, even powerlifting side, or personally, where do you kind of go? Who do you follow for like resources and stuff to kind of stay on the forefront of some of this things coming out?
Sure. So I think on the coaching side and the strength conditioning side, people I work with past and present, you know, staff here at Maryland and the people I've worked with at Rutgers and Missouri State and Iowa, like I lean on them, whether it be, you know, talking to them or just remembering the things that they did and kind of being like, okay, now I can kind of understand why they did these things. And then just having conversations with the people around me. That's been huge for me. And then, like you said, like having conversations with coaches too has been beneficial in terms of wrapping my head around that like specific sport context. And then honestly, I hate kind of saying this, but Instagram has been pretty good for me. Not in the fact that it's like, oh, I see this one thing on Instagram and then I start applying it to my training. It's more along the lines of like, okay, that was interesting. Let me start to research this a little bit more. Let me start reaching out to different coaches and different people and start having these conversations and understanding where they're coming from with this stuff. You know, social media has its pros and cons for sure, but I think that like it's definitely opened up the door to connecting with different people. You know, I've met a lot of, maybe not met, but, you know, I've interacted with, is probably the better word, with a lot of people through that, that's, you know, definitely opened my eyes to some different things that I never would have experienced had I not done that. And then I guess, did you say from the powerlifting side too, or no?
Yeah.
Yeah, from the powerlifting side, has honestly been my coach, Steve. He's been awesome because he's always kind of like kept me in check in a way, because he knows like how I am and how I can kind of like go down rabbit holes and start doing certain things. And then he'll also like, he'll reel me back in, but at the same time, he'll kind of, he'll give me different information to work with, whether it be, you know, new training styles, new ideas in terms of like how to apply different training methodologies and things like that, or even just having just basic conversations about stuff that we might have seen, or different techniques and things like that. So I owe a lot of the things that I've learned from him. And then training partners and teammates too. Like I mentioned before, I train with some amazing powerlifters. It's insane like how strong they are. And you know, there was just nationals this past weekend, and getting to watch them compete and like put up these absolutely absurd numbers is just mind-boggling. So if I ever get a chance to like pick their brain, I usually am. Like for my past meet that I just did, I wasn't overly satisfied with the performance. So I remember like going up to some of those guys and being like, what do I need to work on? What needs to be fixed here? What can I do better? So that way this doesn't happen again. And then not even just those guys, but then other amazing lifters through social media as well. Like just kind of messaging them and kind of see if I see something that I thought was interesting, or like a specific technique, or something that they've been doing, I take that and I try to like get more information out of them, so that way I can learn and apply it to my own training.
That's awesome, man. Always looking for some way to improve, and like basically just finding anybody and anything that you can actually kind of take and put it in your toolbox. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So we end the show like any good training session with a finisher. So I got 4 quarters for you, 4 questions, and then we're going to go for overtime today. But you can take as long as you want for them, or you can go rapid fire. You ready?
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
All right. So first one I got for you, biggest influence in strength and conditioning and biggest influence in powerlifting.
Oh man, that's tough. I for strength and conditioning, I really can't pin it down to one particular person, because every coach that I've ever interacted with has applied something to me or has given me something that I can run with, right? So I honestly, coaches at Iowa, coaches at Missouri State, coaches at Rutgers, coaches here at Maryland, like those have all been insanely huge influences on me. And if I did not interact with them, I would not be like who I am today or where I am today for that matter. From the powerlifting side of things, again, I'm gonna have to say my coach. Like he's, if it wasn't for him, like I would not be still competing today, or even competing today. So I have to thank him. He's been a huge influence on me.
Awesome. What can you be found doing when you're not coaching or competing? What are some of your go-to hobbies outside of the weight room?
Yeah, man. Definitely spending time with family. That's huge for me. Being back on the East Coast is great. I'm originally from New Jersey. So now that I'm here in Maryland, it's pretty nice just being able to pop up whenever I need to. When I'm not doing that, usually just exploring DC. That's been really fun for me because I feel like there's just always something to do, always somewhere to go and kind of walk around and check out. And then I've also been trying to cook a little bit more recently too. So that's been kind of fun. I have no idea what I'm doing half the time. Usually I'm just throwing stuff into a pan and hoping it works out. But so that's been fun.
Yeah, when it doesn't work out, as long as it's cooked through, it's just monster mash.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Hey, so if you've given it any thought, what do you think you would be doing if you were not coaching? And maybe if you would have not found Steve, what sport do you think you would have picked up instead of powerlifting?
In terms of, I guess something that I wouldn't done instead of coaching, I feel like I probably would have gone into more like computer science now looking back at it. I've always been like super interested on the technology side of things. So I feel like that probably, if I didn't go like the whole human physiology route, like that's probably where I would have went, is something along those lines. Just complete tangent from what I'm doing now, but maybe not so much because I'm still involved in it with the sports science side of things, but I think something like that would have been interesting. And then if I wasn't doing powerlifting, I'd probably would be doing Olympic weightlifting, honestly. I always found that sport fascinating, just because it's honestly just super fun to watch. Like if I ever see Ben training in here, I always like take a minute to just like watch him knock out a snatch or a clean. And I'm just like, wow, that looks amazing. I can't do that.
Yeah, switch 9 for 9 for 6 for 6.
Yeah, exactly. Always
go.
got to be a barbell involved somehow, I guess.
I like it. Hey, so if you're setting up an ideal training day for you, what's your go-to either PR song or what's on the radio? And then what's your best post-training meal look like?
The music is tough because I have a varying taste, but I guess if I was going to pin it down, like I'm more of like a rock type person when it comes to training. But One by Metallica, that has probably been like, that has hit me with some major PRs in the past. So that's been a go-to. And then post-training food, got to go with like a steak, some steak and potatoes or something like that. Call me old-fashioned, but that's always been good for me.
Easy enough. All right,
Yeah.
Last one I got for you for overtime. Most valuable piece of advice you've received, and if you want to share, from who?
Yeah. So I mentioned this one earlier, and it's like, you're going to make mistakes. Because I'm someone that like kind of attributes themselves, like I'm a perfectionist. Like if I make a mistake, like I always kind of beat myself up about it, and I hate doing that. Hate making the mistakes, and I never want to do that. That has been huge for me. I got that from Ashley Renteria. She's one of the strength and conditioning coaches over at Iowa. So like that's something that's always kind of resonated with me, whether I was an intern or a GA. And now even as a full-time person, just kind of taking that and learning from it.
I like it, man. That's great. That's definitely great advice. Always taking something to learn from. I mean, you've been at 4 different places, being able to pick and choose from all those, being able to rely on those coaches and kind of continuously search and making mistakes and learning from them. That's That's the mark of a good coach for sure. So, hey, for people that got any questions, want to follow you along, if you've got any competitions coming up, where can people get a hold of you?
So Instagram and Twitter, at LS Tomasiello, Tomasiello. You can also email me, ltomas, LTOMAS @umd.edu. Competitions, I'm thinking about it. Nothing quite yet. I'm just still kind of determining what I want to do yet. So
yeah, well due rest after Virginia Nationals too. So
yeah, that was that took a lot out of me. I'm not gonna lie. I got all that feed. I was just like, I need a week off.
Hey, you got a PR in this. What, you got PR in squat too? So
yeah, meet PR in squat, meet PR in bench, and then deadlift just didn't go the way I wanted it to. So
hey, 2 out of 3 is not bad. So hopefully we see you on the platform pretty soon, man. But like I said, I can't thank you enough for coming on today. It was great to talk to you a little bit more and hear about everything you got going on, coaching career wise, competitively, and then everything going on at Maryland at the moment, man. So thanks again.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. It was a blast.
Of course, man. Take care.
You too.
That's it for this episode of The Strength Game. Thank you again to this week's guest and to our sponsors, Cerberus Strength. Be sure to connect and keep up with our guests at the links in the description below. Remember to subscribe to us on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast provider to stay up to date on all future episodes. Also, check us out on YouTube and CoachO'Brien.com, where you can find all the video versions of these episodes, as well as show notes, episode schedule, and much more. Comments, ratings, and reviews are always welcome and appreciated. Thanks again for tuning in, and be sure to join us next week for another great episode of The Strength Game.